It's wonderful to have you with us. Thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, you're welcome. It's great to be here.
Great, and it was good to meet you at Andrew Bridgen's gathering in December when he brought together many of those names to speak on excess deaths, and it was great to bump into you there. And people can obviously find you at Prof N Fenton on Twitter, and of course your Substack. Where are the numbers.substack.com? Where are the numbers.substack.com? People can also find, and on your Twitter profile, you're down as making sense of math, probability, and risk. I think we're going to look a little bit at that, and then how statistics are used to manipulate and trick us. And we've seen that in full flow over the last 4 years, COVID tyranny. But maybe before we get into that, I could just ask you, just take a moment. Haven't had you on. I've followed you for a long time online because you produce the data and figures and analyze it, and that's been extremely invaluable over the last couple of years. But maybe take a moment and introduce yourself before we jump into the topic.
Yeah, okay. So I'm an Emeritus Professor of Risk at Queen Mary, University of London. I actually retired at the end of December 2022, partly because of the pressures I was coming under for being a kind of like COVID dissident at that point. That I came in for a lot of stick. There were plenty of people who outside the university wanted to get rid of me. They didn't like the idea that there was a professor at a major university who was challenging the government narrative on COVID, vaccines, lockdowns, and all that sort of stuff. But so it was part of the reason why I retired. There were some personal reasons, but that was an important reason. I wasn't getting a lot of great support from the university either, I have to say. But yeah, so I retired there. My background is I'm a mathematician by training, and for the last 30 years, I guess, I've been applying probability and various mathematical techniques, Bayesian probability in particular, to problems of sort of critical risk assessment, which included kind of like medical risk assessment. So it was inevitable that when the whole COVID thing started, and it was clearly going to be data driven, that I'd be looking, I and other members of my team would be looking at that stuff. And so that's what we do. I use maths and probability to try and understand and help people understand different types of critical risks, including medical risk, but not restricted to that. We looked at, I've been involved in stuff like transport risk, risks of all kinds of different critical systems, legal risks, that type of stuff.
Okay, well, before we get into that, let me just play a little video that you put up, and I think I had to watch it a couple of times and thought, I think Dr. Fenton's trying to pull a swift one on this, because I've seen something different. But you told it how easily we are fooled. So let me just play this little 90-second video, and then we'll jump in from there.
So the question here is, which of the squares A or B is lighter? Which seems like a ridiculous question. It's clearly B. But what I'm going to do here is I'm simply using a paint package to cut out square B and place it over square A. So that's me just cutting it out, placing it over. And there you can see they're exactly the same. There's absolutely no trickery involved here. All I did is just do that cut out and paste. And again, similar example with these two different coloured dresses, but are they? You can see that part is incredibly enough exactly the same. This is an example of what we call confirmation bias. Here's a kind of really heavily digitized image. What do you see here? Most people can't really see anything at all. But what I'm going to now do is reveal what the actual image is. And you can see it's this baseball player. And the thing is, if I now show you back to the original image, it's hard not to see what the real image is. And of course, this is a classical problem of forensic science, because you were genuinely uncertain about what the partial image was. But once you've seen the full image, you're absolutely certain about what the partial image is. And finally, there's this illusion of a moving staircase at the San Siro Stadium, but it's simply just people walking in the same direction.
Wow, when you see it, you see it. That is so true. I think it was Lilani Dardine on her post or on her feed. I saw that coming up. How easily we are fooled. Are you sure you're not playing trickery with any of those images?
No, they're all classic visual illusions. And I always used to start, when I was lecturing, I always used to start my series of lectures on risk by introducing those types of probability illusions, because those types of visual illusions, because the probability illusions that people succumb to are just as powerful and just as bewildering. So I think the one I always follow that with, the sort of the first probability illusion, is that I show a sequence. I say, well, imagine that you toss a coin 16 times, and you reveal that you get sort of 16 all 16 heads. All 16 are tails, actually. And then you look at another sequence, and you've got a kind of like random selection of heads and tails, and you ask which is the more likely that you'd observe. And people, of course, automatically assume it's the sort of the heads, tails, head. They assume that the 16 tails is kind of like impossible. But of course, anybody who's done basic probability theory will know that, assuming it's a fair coin, you're just as likely to get a sequence of 16 out of 16 tails as you are to get what looks to be like a completely random sequence. So you've got stuff like that people don't understand. In fact, curiously, the 16 tails, the 16 consecutive tails, is actually more likely because of certain physical features of the difference between heads and a tail on a coin. And then I go on to things like the birthdays problem. It's a classic case. If you've got 23 children in a room, what's the probability that at least 2 of them will have the same birthday? And people sort of think about this, and they're sort of thinking about themselves. They're thinking about what's the probability that another child in the room has got the same birthday as me, and they'll do things like, well, is it saying like 23 over 365? They'll do things like that. So I think it's sort of quite unlikely. But the answer is actually there's better than a 50% chance. And it's because people don't realize that it's not just, you're not just thinking about a specific pair of children. It's basically there's a lot of combinations of pairs of children. And then when you do the maths, it's not that difficult, the maths. I mean, I've got videos explaining this sort of stuff. You discover that there's actually a better than 50% chance. And if you go up to, in a class of 30 children, there's actually an over 90% chance that you're going to get at least 2 with the same birthday. And so these are sort of classical probability, I call them classical probability illusions. And the use of sort of what I would call probability tricks like that were, of course, very prevalent in pushing, bizarrely, the COVID narrative. And I've done videos and simulations and stuff like that, showing, for example, how with a very simple, the classic misclassification of recently vaccinated people as unvaccinated. So if you get vaccinated, if you catch COVID, you become COVID positive within, let's say, 14 days of the COVID vaccination, you're typically classified, normally, you're classified as unvaccinated, right? But with that simple misclassification, if you take a vaccine, which is just a placebo, has no impact whatsoever, you will get, once you ramp up a vaccination program, you will get this sort of 90-95% efficacy simply because of that misclassification, where there's no efficacy at all.
Wow. But were you not one of the first people the government called on to make sense of their data whenever they started looking at it?
No, I wasn't, because I was always maybe a bit of an outsider. There's maybe, I mean, they call on, I mean, maybe there's a little bit of background here, because I did in 2015, I actually presented a BBC documentary called on climate change by numbers. I was a co-presenter with Professor Sir David Spiegelhalter and Professor Hannah Fryer. And interesting enough, I think that was maybe Hannah Fry's first documentary with BBC, and she went on to like have a very sort of really stellar career, because she's I think she's their main kind of like science documentary presenter now. The reason why that was my first and only appearance on the BBC is because I was very skeptical. I didn't like the way that documentary turned out. I didn't like the way it was edited, and I made clear afterwards, privately, I didn't make it public at the time, that I was very unhappy with some of the things I've been scripted to say, because what people don't realize is those documentaries, I mean, that documentary was just a pure propaganda piece, to support the sort of the hysterical climate change narrative. And I was very unhappy with some of the things I had to say. And in particular, there was one statement which I was very uncomfortable with, and I went back to they have these consultants, because I'm not a climate scientist. They chose us because we were supposedly independent mathematicians who hadn't been, involved in sort of the climate debate. We, and stuff like that. We were just supposed to be looking at the kind of models and the data and presenting what they were saying. So they had their own climate experts who were actually doing the scripting of this stuff. And I challenged one of them. I said to one of them, are you sure this is, I don't feel comfortable about saying this. Are you sure it's okay? Yeah, it's absolutely fine. It's absolutely fine. And after the program went out, a colleague pointed out to me, you realize that was, not only was that wrong, what you said there, but, the person that expert who told you basically to say it, himself in his own recent work is clearly showing that it's not true. So I got on the phone to this person afterwards and said, well, you assured me this was okay. This is all kind of kosher. And his response was basically, we have to lie for the greater good. And I kind of like, this is basically a lot of what goes on in sort of climate science. And I think it also has gone on in the science of COVID as well. These people are completely convinced. They're so convinced that they are right and that there's they feel they have a kind of like a moral duty to protect us, whether it's from, climate change or dangers of COVID, that they are prepared to just sort of lie for the greater good. And the evidence isn't there, but it's just like, they feel that this is what they have to do in order to convince people.
Well, I guess looking at the COVID side, you've talked about how officials manipulated data to exaggerate the crisis. But even prior to that, I guess, at the beginning, there wasn't really the data. And it was more the data of fear, of numbers or of images. And that was there to replace any data, and the government made decisions on that. So I'm kind of assuming then that if the data comes out and it conflicts with that, then you need to work on the data to make sure it doesn't conflict, or else you're going to look very foolish because the measures you've taken initially have not been based on anything.
Yeah, but they didn't. They doubled down on the bad data. This is the thing. I mean, sorry, I didn't. You asked me, why did they turn to me to look at the original data? And I guess the spiel I was giving about the BBC thing was that I was already kind of like fingered as a maverick in this kind of like risk. So they in the sort of the risk profession, as it were, professional risk expert. So the government didn't call on me. I did present material to the government along with colleagues, but they basically ignored everything that we said. I mean, very early on, we were one of the first to point out. Actually, we managed to get we did manage to get 2 or 3 papers published in peer-reviewed journals, because it wasn't seriously challenging the narrative then. We were simply pointing out that the infection fatality rates, i.e. how deadly they were claiming COVID to be, were exaggerated based on the publicly available data at the time. And what we were pointing out was consistent with what people like John Ioannidis and Stanford were also pointing out. And that was actually, people were talking about it then, but but there was still this fear that, okay, it might, they were still thinking it's still pretty deadly, that even if it's only like at the time we were saying like once for elderly people who got it, the probability of dying was still under 1% or whatever. But they were still hyping up that, we don't know what's coming, it's going to get worse, all that type of thing. So it didn't really challenge it. I only really became completely ostracized and they started calling for my head and wanting me to be sacked and all that sort of stuff, came with the mass testing, because this was the biggest scam of all. Because we knew early on that if you mass test a bunch of largely asymptomatic people, which is what happened when they eased the first lockdown, right? So the first lockdown started to ease around about late summer, early autumn of 2020, because they then wanted to get people back to school and back to work and stuff like that. And so what they did was they started mass testing people who were asymptomatic, people who didn't have symptoms. Previously, in the early days, it was only people who actually had symptoms were being tested. And amongst those, because of the stupid PCR test, it was kind of like showing, most of these people got symptoms, they'll come up positive on a PCR test. So you had these higher case rates for given that amount of testing. But what they didn't realize is that the asymptomatics, even though the so-called false probability rate was seen to be quite low, i.e. the probability that a person who didn't have the virus will test positive is quite low. Actually, at a time when you've got not that many people infected and you're testing a whole load of asymptomatics, you will get a whole load of new fake false case numbers. Most of the people at that point, most of the asymptomatics who were testing positive didn't have any virus and didn't go on to get symptoms or whatever. But you were getting, the case numbers were being massively driven up. And this was all part of, it's what seemed to me to be a plan to get the necessary fear instilled in preparation for the vaccine rollout, because we didn't have the vaccine then. People were going back to work, right? How were they then going to introduce a vaccine rollout without making people realize that, hang on a sec, it's really bad. The case numbers are, there's these massive case numbers going into the early autumn and winter of 2020-21. We've got to drive these case numbers up in order to make people feel they have to get the vaccine as the only way out of it. And so you had before the vaccine, that massive increase in case numbers because of the mass asymptomatic testing program. That was enough to get to the second lockdown, remember, in the early part of the winter of 2020. And then, hey presto, the only way out of the lockdown is the vaccine at that point.
It really does seem like a case of lies, damn lies, and statistics, in that you can remove different fields, different parts of the data, and therefore move it towards another way, and simply not recording people as vaccinated if it hadn't been 14 days or 21 days after having a jab, then you could immediately dismiss that. And I mean, that is to me a perfect example of how you take the data and choose which subsets to use, and then what message you want to put out from it.
Yeah, and absolutely. And look at it's even worse with the deaths, remember. You've got that officially anybody who died within 28 days of a positive PCR test, no matter what reason, was classified as a COVID death. Okay, so of course you'd be run over and, sort of 27 days after having to have tested positive for PCR test, die in hospital the next day, you're classified as a COVID hospitalization and a COVID death, of course. So you've got, that was got that massive manipulation. And of course, we know that, we knew at the time that most of the people who were classified as dying of COVID, who weren't these sort of accidental deaths, we know that it was their comorbidities that were actually killing them rather than any sort of novel virus. I mean, I'm not one of these who says that there wasn't any novel virus, right? I mean, you always get these novel coronaviruses all the time, but it was no more. What we're convinced is that there was no pandemic there, and it wasn't as deadly. It was just like any other, a bad flu season. Now, interesting enough, this is not kind of like not a massive revelation, but finally, after not having stuff published for a long, they basically were censoring all of our research on this. So after the initial couple of papers in the early spring of 2020, we didn't get any of our papers which were challenging the narrative published. But funnily enough, just in the last couple of days, this is a bit of an advert, I am a co-author on a paper which has been published in the Journal of Clinical Medicine, which has showed that basically none of the government interventions, whether it was the lockdowns, the masking, or the vaccines, had any impact whatsoever on the spread of COVID, on their case numbers and death numbers, right? It was just seasonality. It was just the coronavirus seasonality, which was impacting those things. So that's so that's out now. That paper's getting a little bit of attention. It was very difficult, of course, to get that paper published, and we had to sort of tone down a lot of the conclusions. But it's so there's finally we're getting the cracks are showing that now people are talking more about the fact that was there really ever a pandemic here? Why did we ever do any of these things? I mean, we knew at the time. I was at the time, of course, calling all these things out as crazy, and I was called crazy for doing so. But now, finally, at least we can talk about these things. But with hindsight, all of them, the statistical manipulations that they were pulling off were quite ridiculous.
I think it seems to be too late for truth. You've talked about information coming out, and I know one of your recent posts, it was in, I think, The Sun, talking about a new wave, maybe bigger than before, and of course we will have to wear masks to combat this. And you're kind of scratching your head thinking, have you not read the information that's come out? It seems to be very difficult to change that mindset in people, that they've decided through fear or trust in government or pressure in family or fear of losing job, whatever reason, that whatever new evidence comes out, they've already decided. And there's a massive difficulty in actually changing that public perception, isn't there?
There really is. I mean, there's that cognitive dissonance here. Part of it's because so many people did get vaccinated and they're reluctant, and a lot of people got their children vaccinated or got their parents vaccinated and stuff like that. So even if those people might not have been inclined to do so, but they, the fear, the whole fear tactic worked there. We have to do this to protect our loved ones, all that type of thing. And I think a lot of those people are maybe aware of loved ones who have had serious adverse reactions from the vaccine, maybe people who've died and stuff like that. But because they themselves, took the vaccine and got others to do it, the cognitive dissonance is so great that they cannot bring themselves to believe that they were genuinely doing themselves and their loved ones harmed. And so you've got that cognitive dissonance that they're not able to come out openly and accept, what the reality of the situation is. And similarly because they bought in also to the lockdowns and the masking. Similarly for that, that's it. It is a cognitive dissonance thing. But also you've got the fact that I was saying that there's little chinks of light now in the sort of mainstream media getting through that this thing, was never a sort of a major pandemic. But in the main, they are still pushing the narrative. I mean, as you said, I put out that tweet about the article in The Sun yesterday where they're pushing it like, oh my God, it's going to be worse than ever, get back to masking, all that sort of stuff. So they're still sort of pushing that. They're still pushing people are the mainstream media still pushing the boosters and stuff like that, although people aren't actually buying it. People know deep down that there's no point in this. So, I don't know. Do you know many people who are actually getting the booster?
No, I think anyone who might got the booster isn't really talking to me anymore anyway.
Yeah, there's that. But I actually think even people who were absolutely, friends and colleagues, family members who were calling me, sort of the worst possible things for telling them at the beginning not to get vaccinated. Those people are saying, actually, you're right. I'm not bothering with this anymore. It's, we don't think it is safe. We're not convinced it is safe. And also, what's the point? COVID's just like a bad cold. It's quite funny that the Sun article that came out yesterday is quite funny because it actually was talking about the symptoms of this new strain that they're talking about. And the only main symptoms seems to be a runny nose. They're even saying that all the worst symptoms, things like the loss of taste and smell, actually aren't there anymore. It's a runny nose basically, and you might get a headache.
Yeah, it does.
You might get a cough as well, but not so bad as the previous coughs. Yeah.
No, it does seem to be that. I was actually intrigued at that meeting that Andrew Bridgen had in December. You had Dr. Ryan Cole, Dr. Pierre Corey, you had Steve Kirsch, Dr. Rob Malone, Angus Dalglish. You had many round there, and I was intrigued that twice that you weren't necessarily on that talk table speaking, but twice it was, we have Dr. Norman Fenton here. Maybe you could add to this. And obviously, during the exposing, I guess, the lies and the tyranny, that's taken a lot of different individuals from different aspects of society working together. But your role has been quite key in looking at the information, because the government were able to bamboozle us with figures, with numbers, and tell us, and therefore it was just accepted. But you're able to go deeper. So that is a intriguing, I guess, responsibility you weren't expecting 4 years ago.
Yeah, no, it wasn't. But it's interesting. People have said, why wasn't I asked to be on that panel? I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure if I would have been, because I think the idea was that there seems to have been certain people who had been promoted to be the sort of the prominent spokespeople for the anti-official narrative, and a lot of those are those sort of you've got those American scientists that you mentioned there, and you've got in the UK there've been people like Asim Malhotra, people like that. Well, what's interesting is that none of those people, actually none of them were speaking out against the exaggerated data or anything like that from the beginning. In fact, most of those people, even as late as months into the vaccine program, was still actually, believe it or not, promoting the vaccine. Yeah. So even people like, Asim Malhotra on his, I know Asim well, and great admirer of his. But on his own admission, he was promoting, the vaccine in the spring of 2000, as late as the spring of 2021. Robert Malone, of all people, who had a role in inventing the mRNA platform, was double vaccinated with the mRNA vaccine himself. Steve Kirsch, and you've got people, all of those people. They were not challenging the narrative at the beginning, and the people who were, I'm not by no means the most prominent here, but others who were have not been allowed, at any time during these 4 years to really become the kind of like the voice of the pandemic story, and certainly we've never been. I mean, going back to your original thing, I was never been asked by any official, government body, anything like that, to have any input or comment on any of this stuff. I wasn't, it's only stuff that we've done. I mean, I'm part of the Heart Group. I play a minor role in the Heart Group. So the Heart Group has attempted to sort of force its views on the official bodies and the government ministers, but in general, we've just been sort of chirping away. In the background, I've been exposing, problems with, the mRNA and the Office for National Statistics. In some cases, we've forced them to do things that they wouldn't have otherwise done. We've had a little bit of impact there, but never, it's always been very, a very reluctant. They've been very reluctant to have us appear in any kind of formal capacity and have any real impact on the narrative.
Yeah, no, it's been extremely curious. I agree. Looking at how media and campaigns throughout individuals that you maybe haven't necessarily come across, don't necessarily fit that. But then one way is you say, well, we'll just go with it. And I mean, obviously you've been on with Mark Stein, and Mark Stein has suffered greatly from having the jab. And I guess those stories, it's sad, very sad personally, but it's important collectively to have those stories to point out how it has failed people.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you talk about Mark Stein because, of course, tying into this thing about the mainstream media, I mean, he was, of course, had this for a year. He did have his 1 hour primetime slot on GB News.
Yep.
And although I don't know whether you call that mainstream media, but this is television. There's a big difference from the masses out there, the sort of the ordinary people need to see stuff on television before they can really kind of like take it in. So, there's people think that Twitter and Substack and all that have an impact, but they don't on the main part of the population. People are completely oblivious to, to any of that stuff. It has to be at least on the television, right? And at least GB News was the TV. People could tune in without having to go to the internet to see it, right? And, Mark had that show, and it was a brilliant show.
Yeah.
And of course, it was the one place where he spoke about these things. He spoke about, the manipulated government statistics, and which were, basically distorting the whole narrative, the sort of thing that, we were talking about. And of course, he spoke about the vaccine harms, and that was critical. And he was the only person doing that on television. And of course, what happens to him? Ofcom come in, and he's booted off, and he's kicked off of GB News. I mean, and at the time when he actually had the heart attack as well, so it couldn't have come at a worse time for him. But that shows you the extent, to which it's still very, very difficult to get this message out. We are still not really getting it out.
No, 100%. And part of that is a kind of, you were asked at that meeting to help supply data. Well, first of all, you were asked, would you go to the COVID inquiry? And Andrew Bridges said, what would be the point? Which I do get, and I probably agree with that understanding, because it's not there to expose wrongdoings to the government. It's there to tick the box and make sure they can continue this in another time. But it's actually, I think it was David Davis asked about some of the data, and you've written a piece on this entitled "The Data We Need from the ONS to Prove the COVID Vaccines Are Safe and Effective." Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about that? Because there does seem to be many gaps, and the UK seemingly has better data than many other countries, although we in the UK maybe are frustrated at the lack of data. But I think often people look at the UK, I think often Israel, for data that isn't available in other countries. But tell us a little bit more about that piece that you've written about what data we need.
Yeah, the question came about because of the New Zealand data, right, which was discussed at the meeting. The point is that there was this sort of release of, secret data from, which was basically represented a very substantial proportion of the New Zealand population. And what it had was, for each individual there, it had things like, obviously their age, and if they died, the date of death. But it also had the exact dates of when they got each dose of a vaccination, and stuff like that. And therefore you were able, in theory, to get a picture of whether people who were vaccinated, because you had both the sorry, I beg your pardon, that only had that was only restricted to vaccinated people, right? But you could, in theory, from that learn about whether increasing the number of doses that you took was increasing your likelihood of a severe adverse reaction or death and stuff like that. So you could infer some significant things about the safety of the vaccine from that. Now, I think it was, as I've gone on the record as saying, I kind of disagreed to a certain extent with Steve Kirsch on this, because he thought it was a game changer. And this was really this was the real reveal on the vaccine safety. I think it gave us some indication of increased probability of death with the number of doses you took, but it wasn't a massive impact, right? But it was the data, it was the sort of the quality and the detail of the data was relevant. And what I was saying was that what David Davis asked was, well, is that the sort of data that you need to really answer all the questions you want to answer about the effectiveness and safety of the vaccine? And I said, well, I'll put together a list of the data you need, and it did include things like we would need to have for each individual for whom there was a record of any sort, a medical record of any sort. We would want to know things like if they had a vaccine, then the date of each vaccine, and we would want to know also information about their comorbidities. So there's a list of all these things, and I said, if you had all of this detailed information for at least most of the population of the UK, then all of the questions about the deadliness of COVID, the safety and efficacy of vaccines, all of those would be resolved once and for all. There wouldn't be any doubt about it, right? And interestingly enough, I mean, I haven't heard back from. I haven't heard back from David because the idea was that he was going to then send that on to the Office for National Statistics. Now, I've been in contact. I mean, I know the people who are supposedly responsible for that data at the Office for National Statistics. I've been in contact with them, and they've always been resistant. They'll give reasons why they can't provide that data. It's not in one place, because it's not just the ONS has this data. There's like the National NIMS, the National Immunology Management System, has their own database, but it should be easily within the capability of the Office for National Statistics to collate that data into a single database. And I believe it's interesting, because I think that they have the data, and we believe they have provided it. Certainly other national governments who claim not to have any publicly available data like this that can be inspected have provided to the pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer in order for their trials. They did provide this kind of detailed data. So it is out there, but it seems that they're determined that we're never going to see it, and therefore we are never going to be able to prove. And because this is something you could use it to actually prove the answers to the questions about the safety and efficacy, for example, of the vaccines.
I think I've learned from working for Lord Pearson in Parliament for well over 10 years that if the government don't want to answer a question, they won't answer it. And you can ask half a dozen times. There's a reason why this information is hidden away. There's a reason why the so-called COVID inquiry has not brought this information out. It's that it's not supposed to be there for public consumption. And I guess the pharma companies have also a role to play because it could bring up lots of issues on liability and false information being put out there.
Yeah, I think that we are not going to have this stuff in the public domain for another 20 years. I mean, maybe in 20 years' time, there will be real inquiries into why they unleashed this completely useless. Let's forget about saying completely useless. It doesn't stop. Not only does it not stop infection transmission, which is widely accepted now, all this nonsense about it stopping hospitalization and death from COVID is also complete nonsense. Of course, I didn't mention that because that's a lot of the stuff we've done. Again, there was lots of statistical manipulation and outright lies which went into that narrative, which incredibly a lot of people still believe. So you still get people like on our side of the argument who know most of the other stuff about the pandemic, which was from the government, which is a lie, still believe that that the vaccines somehow do minimize the chances of you being hospitalized and dying from COVID. And that's complete nonsense, right? So it's completely useless. The vaccines are completely useless. They may also be pretty dangerous. I mean, there is the evidence that they, I believe they are dangerous. I don't believe that it's a mass depopulation agenda, as others are claiming. I don't think we've got the evidence. I mean, there's a lot of people talking about Dennis Rancourt's report on the 17 million deaths worldwide from the vaccine. I don't believe. I'm skeptical of those claims. I think that they might be exaggerated, but certainly the vaccines aren't safe. There's certainly been an enormous number of severe adverse reactions from them. I believe there have been a lot of. I mean, the thing about death. I mean, we're all going to die. This whole thing about we're all going to die at some point. The question is, how much sooner are people who are vaccinated going to die than those who are not vaccinated? And of course, there's an enormous amount of variability. We know that there was massive variability in the doses. Sorry, I haven't got a glass of water here.
No, but because I actually was there in Bucharest, listen to Dennis Rancourt, and I mean, I can take the 70 million. I just don't take the 95% of the world going to die in 5 years. And you're kind of sitting. I don't have the data. That may be true, may not, but I simply don't have the data and haven't seen anything. That I can only go with what I've seen. And the danger is you make hyperbolic statements in this
exactly.
I mean, actually discredit you.
The thing about, again, the 17 million, I mean, it could well be true, but again, it's I believe what we saw actually from the even from the UK data, not definitively because of the corruption, the way in the misclassification, but from what we could infer as best as possible, is that I believe a lot of elderly people died a bit sooner than they would have otherwise died as a result of the vaccine. Okay, so whether that was days, weeks, months, or years, of course, is not clear. And so, what does that really mean? Can we, so if it turned out that 17 million people had died, but had died a week earlier, is that, how much of a big deal of that is that? I don't know. I mean, so those are the questions that we still don't know the answers to, right? Personally, I do know of younger people who I believe got the sort of the turbo cancers. People who've been in remission from cancer did suddenly get the turbo cancer after a booster, for example, stuff like that. Of course, we don't know definitively cause and effect, but anecdotally there does seem to be evidence that there's certainly plenty of real evidence about increased number of disabilities, many of which are associated with known side effects from these vaccines. And we certainly have got the increase in cancers and the cardiac conditions, which again are known to be associated with those are particular side effects known to be associated with these vaccines. So there is mounting evidence. It's just the figures that I'm uncomfortable about quoting. And I did do an analysis based on the UK yellow card system, taking account of data that we know about underreporting and also about the so we took account of both how much is underreported and also what proportion of people reporting to the yellow card are kind of like not serious reports and stuff like that. And I did do an estimate based on that, and I think at the time so this was a bit about last September, I'd reckon at that point there could be as many as 15,000 deaths in the UK kind of like directly due to the vaccine. But again, that doesn't tell you how many of those deaths might have been just a few weeks or months sooner than those people would have died otherwise.
Oh, completely. Well, I mean, it's a huge area, and I'd love to even get onto your conversation on the stat side and the data side on climate change. We will not get into that because that'll be a whole program itself. Dr. Norman Fenton, it is wonderful to have you on. I said, followed you putting out the data on Twitter for years. So thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me.
And people can also find you on Substack. Where are the numbers.substack.com. For those of you using Substack, make sure and sign up to that.